Welcome, everyone, to the Allocation Agenda podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. Today, we have a very interesting guest and point of view with Pradeep Tekkey. Now, Pradeep, you're the Chief Data Officer at Harbor Capital Advisors. And we're going to get into why there is a role for a Chief Data Officer at a financial services company like this. But we're going to get into in a big way because what we're going to talk about today is AI and tech best practices. And if we overlook them, it's at our own peril. And in the investment management industry, there's a lot at risk. And I think that's one of the reasons why there is a chief data officer role in your company and why it's as you called it, a center of excellence. So we want to get into that and understand that a lot more. But a little bit about you beyond your background as the chief data officer, and you've been a chief technology officer. You actually were born and raised an island boy and didn't even have a TV until you were about age 10? I thought that was just fascinating. I'm going to let you explain a little bit more about your background here before we jump in. But I just love to hear a little bit about you and your personal background.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Thanks for having me over. Yes, you're right. People wouldn't have heard of these rather random group of islands in the middle of nowhere, at the east of India, about 1,000 miles off the coast of India, and maybe about 300 miles to the west of Myanmar and Malaysia is a group of islands called Andaman and Nicobar Islands. That's where I was born and brought up. It used to be a penal colony for the British Raj back when they were ruling India. That's where all the convicts were sent. So that's the origin of Andaman Islands. Yes, Steve, I actually did not have a TV till I was almost 15 years old in high school. And that just tells you how remote these group of islands are. It used to take almost 5 days for us to get to a mainland in India because it's still owned by India. And there was no flights at that time. This was when I was growing up and when I went to school there. The only connection to the world was a shortwave radio. And my favorite station at that time was BBC, and shortwave radio connected you to the rest of the world.
Now you have a little bit more connection as what a chief data officer would know. So I would love to just start out, and we teased it here. We're going to be talking a lot about data today and why it's important in the investment management industry, why you have devoted your career and the company has devoted a center of excellence to data and given you a role of chief data officer. Maybe let's just start there. Why is that important to do?
I think that the reason is very clear. Data has become a differentiator in the space, especially asset management space. In my company, Harbor, has been on the forefront understanding why this is such an important reason why we have to bring up or elevate the awareness and the use of data across the firm. This was about a year ago when we found this new department called Harbor Data Intelligence. We have been dealing with the volume and velocity and variety of data for the last 4 or 5 years. And that has primarily quadrupled, if not more. And that caused so many, I would say, inefficiencies because of the variety and volume of data that we had to elevate this. We also, Harbor as a company, realized that data can be a competitive advantage. And we are essentially doubling down on this initiative by elevating the team, people, and the awareness across the firm on how we can use that as a strategic differentiator in this space.
So you brought up two really important things there. One was efficiencies in internal processes and things like that. Another was external, a competitive advantage, a differentiator in the marketplace. Let's talk about each of those separately. What were some of the challenges? Like you said, it's been only about a year or so. There had to be some pretty big challenges that you guys were facing that led to this decision. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I just want to give some background on asset management and how we deal with data and what type of data we deal with at a high level. We have some bright spots in this industry and some weak spots. The bright spots are we have a good level of data consistency, transparency, and integrity of data when it comes to trade settlement, when it comes to order management, shareholder accounting, portfolio management. Those are fairly robust and reliable and much more consistent. Where we have challenge with is when it comes to distribution data. When it comes to, there's no universal standards of data exchange. There are challenges associated with lack of transparency because of omnibus relationships. There's an industry consolidation that essentially results in loss of transparency on the distribution side of things. So it's a combination of good data in one place and really weak and inconsistent data on the other side. As an organization, we realize that this requires some doubling down on this effort, trying to figure out how to get more transparency in the distribution data, make the data that we already have much more reliable and resilient. So that's essentially the genesis of where we found ourselves and why this department was created.
And you talked before when we were speaking about how this allows a complete re-engineering of business processes, because it's one thing taking care of inefficiencies, operational workflows, and things like that give us more time in our day and we can be more proactive. But I'm really interested about this idea of re-engineering business processes. That feels like it's going to the next level.
So again, this is my personal observation and thought behind this is organizations tend to organically grow. And when they grow, a lot of micro inefficiencies that gets developed by individuals or people working on certain processes. They start building things that they are most comfortable with, and then they keep building on top of that scaffolding of applications or things. What I believe every organization need to do, and we certainly at Harvard does this very often, is process reengineering, looking at the processes that work efficiently, and then looking at the processes that don't work efficiently and tear it down and start from the beginning, or lift and shift from one to another business unit and then see how that can be re-engineered. So those things have resulted in tremendous efficiency gain for our company.
When we talk about efficiency gains too, it's all about the people. It's the people that are using these processes and engaging around these processes, conducting business around these processes. And we all know in investment management that we're a relationship-based business. How does what you're doing in your department, how does it help strengthen relationships internally and externally?
So one of the big challenges every organization faces when they deal with the entity they don't control is getting information that they need in a consistent format or consistent, I would say, data speak, consistent layout. When information is exchanged, there's no standard between two companies, whether it's an investment firm, two asset management firm, whether it's a portfolio management or advisory firm to investment management, asset management firm. There is no consistent standard. So one of the early on challenges that I saw is getting everybody to follow the same playbook, use the same rule book, same specification. That has turned out to be more challenging than what I thought. This should be easy. Give them a spec document or things would work out. But what I've discovered is by getting people to play ball, so to speak, using those specifications makes everybody's life so easy. In other words, the data provider follows that standard. This data recipient, my company, loves having data in a consistent format, and lack of that results in a whole lot of operational inefficiencies, especially when it comes to data exchange between companies.
So you had this notion and you called it embracing nimbleness in strategy. What did that mean? What does that mean to you?
I'm a strong believer that anybody who comes up with a 5 to 10 year or even 3 to 5 year technology roadmap is making a mistake, at least in today's world. I've gone back in time and looked at some of the decisions. In 5 years, we'll do X, so in 3 years, we'll do Y. All those things fall flat given the pace of change that I see happening around me. My philosophy is come up with an 18-month plan, year to 18-month plan, because chances are what you're building is going to be redone. Somebody else is going to come up with a better product, a better process. And we see that all the time, especially when we use cloud services. We build some new processes because there was a limitation in the cloud system's capability. And before we deploy, we find out that's already available as a service. And we spend all this time trying to engineer or re-architect something and build something strategically that we thought was good for us, only to be torn down or replaced with something that the vendor already offers as a part of your core service. So I caution anybody to kind of come up with a 3-year, 5-year roadmap on any technology strategy, especially data, because it will be a wasted effort. You might as well come up with a short-term strategy and be nimble and pivot and quickly change direction as these tools and services come along. Adopt and embrace quick and fast.
In that kind of same vein of embrace quick and fast, you talked about embracing variety versus volume. And I thought it was really fascinating because we tend to think that volume is where the game's at. The more data, the better. Let's collect it. Let's keep it. Let's never get rid of it. The more, the better is the mentality. But you have a little different point of view on that.
Yeah, I have started ignoring my Google storage or my Gmail storage ever since I got the account 2 decades ago, because storage is a commodity. Storage can scale infinitely in today's world. So that is no longer a cause of concern. There's compute available that can process through or churn through data like nobody's business. That is not a concern to me. Concern to me is the variety and how do we handle variety of data. That's not really a concern, but that's more of a challenge because the variety is where we see a lot of challenges that companies are not doing well. Volume is no longer a problem. Storage is cheap.
It is. I don't want to date myself. I used to work with Seagate Technologies, and we used to laugh about who's going to need a gigabyte drive? Why, who's going to ever use up a gig? That's incredible. So here's the thing. Data, and we've been talking so far about the volume of data, center of excellence around data, reworking, re-engineering, efficiencies. How does all of that translate into what you said up front, which is a competitive advantage for the firm?
So one way we at Harbor, we take advantage of the variety in velocity of data that we get is building stronger data lineage, building strong data catalog, and dependency of one source and another source. By the way we have architected these environment allows us to ask questions of data. Like if a business user looks at a report and is unable to identify where did this come from? I'm sure in the old days, you had to go ask Bob, who actually created the report, and say, Bob, can you explain to me where did it come from? How did you get this information? And it's mostly an institutional knowledge or a tribal knowledge where somebody, oh, I remember that this comes from the system, or I built this, so I know where it came from. That is different now. The platforms you're building, actually you can query the system and ask it, where did this originate from? And it can actually tell you the lineage of the data, the source of the data, when did it arrive, where was it sent to, how was it transformed, and who was the consumer of this application. Those data lineages become a very important attribute because the number of files and data that we receive is so huge. It's going to be hard to find people who knows exactly where this came from. You almost have to ask the system where it came from, and we are able to walk backwards to the source and find out where it came from. So those are some of the benefits of re-architecting our environment in a way that we can ask those kind of questions and get those kind of answers back from our data ecosystem. We call it the data lake, but that's pretty much universal now. Data lake is a universal concept.
When we had one of our previous conversations, you made me think about a quote from a former CEO of a major tech company that said, there's a difference between data and information, knowledge and decision-making. How you architect the data and re-engineer the processes, how does that serve up actionable insights and feed into better knowledge and understanding so that there's better decision-making, better products that you're putting together, better returns in your portfolios? Is that a major part of the thought process of how you're creating and handling data inside the company?
So a lot of the decision made today is derived, or it is driven by data, if not fully, at least in part. We would not know if a specific information that is produced, a report or what have you, published on a website, one would not know whether that is being consumed by anybody unless you have data to capture the statistics of how many times was it open, how many times was it downloaded, how many times did people send an email from the platform or set notifications saying, hey, remind me whenever this document is updated, send me an email. So unless we capture those sort of information at a minute level, it's going to be very difficult for any team, for example, a marketing team, to make a decision whether we should produce that information. If it's not being consumed, why produce it? Why expend resource creating something that's not being produced? However, on the other hand, if it is being produced, you now have a compelling business case why you should double down on that and improve that content. So that's just one example of how having the data to validate your or hypothesis or even refute your hypothesis is so important. Now, that's just one example on a document published on a website. Now, we can stretch that to every aspect of our function, a certain type of report internally within the company. Why are we maintaining it? Why is that being produced? Why is that energy not spent on producing something more actionable for another team? So those are some small examples how every decision that we make has to be backed by data, at least substantiated by data, and we can prove or disprove some hypothesis.
And you went into a lot of articulation on, so that's better decision making. But what you just introduced there was another whole area of benefit category that goes into competitive advantage, which was you talked about how if we're doing something that nobody's using, internally consuming it in order to make those decisions or externally, then why go through the time and the effort and the resources to do that? That's part of the streamlining, the efficiencies, but you took it all the way to helping organizations handle like fee pressures, which we all have in this industry. If you could help the firm address those fee pressures, that's a tremendous thing. So tell me a little bit about how that works and how you help on that front.
I think many asset management firms are not immune to the fee pressure, and it is not unusual to expect that people have to produce more with less, or the efficiency is name of the game. And how do you do that? How do you deliver more value to the business? How do you produce more reports? How do you create more analytics? How do you create more data pipelines? How do you keep up with the demands of new product? The only way you can do that is through efficiency and through cutting areas of the business, areas of the work that is not productive. Efficiency is name of the game. My philosophy is to strive to focus on the area that adds the most value to the company and drop the one that does not add value to the company. But going back to my previous point, you can't make that a decision unless you have the data to back it up. You have to almost rely on information analytics that tells you that this is materially not being used, or this information is materially not being consumed by anybody, or certain things are not being touched by anybody. So drop that, focus on things that matter.
This rolls together in terms of impacting decision-making, strategy, efficiencies, fee pressures. You go down and down the list of everything that you've been saying. And one thing that comes to a conclusion is that data and technology and who controls that and who oversees that deserves a seat at the table. And you've been given that seat. You're a chief data officer, but that's not the case throughout the industry. And it's almost like technology and data management can be seen as a support function. What do you say to other firms that might be listening right now in advice on this subject?
All I would say is ignore data and technology at your own peril. I strongly believe that data and technology has to be used by companies that want to survive in today's world. It is a differentiator. It's no longer an operational center or operational cost center. Data is something that can be used and exploited by business to make better decision making and give them a competitive advantage. And you can't do that if you treat that as a cost center and say, okay, this falls under some department and all they need is a working computer.
There's so much pressure in the industry these days. There's so much in the investments going into passive investments in indexes and things like that. And as management firms, an active management in showing that we actually can produce better returns than these highly liquid passive investment options, we have to have the data in order to actively manage our portfolios. So you look at it from that lens, and that trend that's going on in the industry right now, is your recommendation double down, triple down? We're not fighting for our lives, but we're fighting for the role of active management in the industry. And that's only going to happen. We're only going to continue to outperform if we have the information, the data, the information, the knowledge in order to make those decisions. Would you agree? It rises up to that level of importance to the point where I actually want to ask you this, put you on the spot here. On a scale of 1 to 10, how important is data to a firm like yours in the investment management industry? Well, it's not important at all. 10, it's vital. It's vital to our operations. It's vital to our growth. It's vital to our competitive advantage. It's vital to our long-term sustainable growth. 1 to 10, where do you put it?
I would say 10 because it would not be far-fetched for me to say if we do not have a data flowing into our environment, whether it is a transaction data, investment data, trade data, anything, market data, then we essentially ground to a halt. So I think data is like water for us. We need it to survive. We need to do more than survive in this space, especially in the active management space. Yes, I would put a score of 10.
And what's interesting, there's a whole area of benefits that you and I talked about that we haven't gotten into. There's the whole area of improving on risk management and ensuring transparency, things that are incredibly important in our industry. Maybe talk for just a little bit on risk management and the role of data.
The fact of the matter is, anytime we receive or process data that involves anything to do with investment data is highly sensitive, highly audited, and highly scrutinized. There are various methodologies, various processes that are deployed. We can tag information. We can see access rights to that tagged data, whether it is sensitive, confidential, PII, architecting a right solution where there are proper tagging of information and then classifying those information with proper access control, who need to access to that data, when do they need access to, and essentially minimum access rights. In other words, if deny access unless you need it. Those are some of the core principles that I instill and make sure that there are solid processes, good controls in place, minimum access needed unless required, deny. Those are some of the fundamental principles that are deployed in our data ecosystem that has served pretty well.
So here's one thing that I know for sure is that we could go on for a long time, but we've already covered a lot of territory. And our poor human brains, we can only remember about 2 or 3 things at a time. If there was one thing that you wanted the audience of investor relations people on both sides of the fence, LPs and GPs, right, that are watching this right now, what's the one most important takeaway that you'd want to convey?
I still go back to the notion that process re-engineering using data and using data across the firm to gain efficiency of manual process is a very ignored field. Unless you sit down with somebody and say, tell me what the problem is that you are solving every day, it is hard for people to raise their hand and say, I'm struggling with this work and this seems like too much of a manual work for me. Can you help me? So my recommendation is encourage open conversation with the individuals more frequently than not. As a chief data officer, one of my responsibilities is to make sure that I talk to department heads, I talk to everybody that uses data or even reports or application and understand their pain points. And oftentimes you'll be surprised how we can solve some of the vexing problems with very little tweaks or very little changes to our system that can provide them the information they need. They have been struggling. They're copying, pasting from one document to another, Excel spreadsheet to another Excel spreadsheet. There's so much opportunity for automation, but unless people either understand or appreciate how this can be automated, you might never raise their hand and say, I need help. And that's where people like me have to make the effort to talk to individual consumers of data or consumers of information to say, okay, what are you struggling with and how can I help you? So that's my kind of advice. And it'll be surprising how with very little delta changes, you can gain a lot of efficiency across a firm.
Makes perfect sense. If people have questions, which I know they will, is it okay if I give out a link to your LinkedIn profile that people could reach out?
Sure.
Thank you. For the mission of this podcast is to bring different perspectives together on how we, as leaders in the investment management industry, how do we create success? How do we evolve with evolving technology and AI and all these different things? And you significantly helped us today. We very rarely get the opportunity to have the perspective of a chief data officer. And I just wanted to say thank you very much. This was very enjoyable and very informative.
All right. Thank you, Steve.